Good afternoon to those watching from the eastern part of the country, and good morning to my friends in the West. Oh, no, we're not starting yet. Good afternoon to those watching from the eastern part of the country, and good morning to my friends in the West. I'm Sue Udry, the Executive Director of Defending Rights and Dissent. At Defending Rights and Dissent, we are a national civil liberties organization that defends your right to know and freedom to act through grassroots mobilization, public education, policy expertise, and advocacy journalism. If you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel and like this video. On Monday, President Donald Trump signed an executive order declaring Antifa a domestic terrorist organization. The White House also issued an explainer with the title, "President Trump isn't backing down from crushing radical left violence." President Trump's actions are perplexing for a number of reasons. There's no organization called Antifa, and there's no domestic terrorism designation. So what's going on? Is this just more bluster from President Trump, or is this paving the way to investigate, disrupt, and dismantle the administration's opponents? To answer these questions, I'm joined today by my policy director, Chip Gibbons. Whenever I have questions about either constitutional law or the long legacy of the national security state's perfidy, I turn to Chip as a resource. Chip is particularly well suited to weigh in here. He's the author of the forthcoming history, The Imperial Bureau, the FBI, Political Surveillance, and the Rise of the U.S. National Security State, which chronicles the FBI's domestic intelligence program's transition from a counter-subversive framework to a counterterrorism one. Chip has also produced original reporting on the FBI for The Intercept, The Nation, In These Times, and Jacobin. Thanks for joining me, Chip. And can you first tell me a little about the context in which this order was issued?
Sure. So 2 weeks ago today, Charlie Kirk was killed while speaking at a college in Utah. Just from the outset, as a First Amendment group, we oppose Mr. Kirk's murder. It is a horrible tragedy for his family, for his friends, for his loved ones. The answer to bad speech, or what you perceive to be bad speech, is more speech. It is not killing your opponent or killing someone you disagree with. That being said, Mr. Kirk was, to put it mildly, a very polarizing figure, given some of his views that he's had. And since his murder, a number of his associates within the Trump administration have made it clear they don't believe the answer to bad speech is good speech, but that people who criticize Mr. Kirk, people who are their opponents on the left, are responsible for his death and that they must be crushed. Stephen Miller has explicitly stated the path forward is not to mimic the ACLU of the mid-90s. It is to take all necessary and rational steps to save the Western civilization. During a episode of Mr. Kirk's podcast hosted by J.D. Vance after Kirk's murder, Miller said, "With God as my witness, we are going to use every resource we had at the Department of Justice, Homeland Security, and throughout the government to identify, disrupt, and eliminate and destroy this network and make America safe again for the American people." So Stephen Miller, J.D. Vance, Donald Trump, and others have made it very clear that the response to Kirk's murder is to destroy the political left in the U.S. Part of this is through this conflation of speech with violence, attempting to blame people who criticized Kirk, including both before and after his death, with killing him, claims that by calling him a racist or comparing him to a Nazi, things that whether you agree with or disagree with are protected speech under the First Amendment, tried to caused his death. I haven't seen the show South Park since 2003. I'm told that Charlie Kirk was parodied on it, and I've seen some people even suggest by parodying Charlie Kirk, the way in which public figures are routinely parodied on television, especially on a show like South Park, at least as I remember it 22 years ago, they've also contributed to his death. So you see this attempt to sort of blame the left writ large for Kirk's death, the day of his death or shortly after. Nancy Mace, who was originally a moderate Republican and has emerged as sort of an inflammatory show person within the Congress, told the media Democrats own this, Democrats are to blame for this. So there's been both an attempt to sort of paint the existence of radical left-wing anarchists as being responsible for this, as well as sort of mainstream Democrats or mainstream NGOs or mainstream funders like George Soros. There were even attacks on, say, Jimmy Kimmel, which Trump is now threatening to sue ABC for putting him back on TV, in case anybody was doubting whether or not that was state coercion or just, a business decision about ratings. And Kimmel's ratings are through the roof since he's been brought back. I've never watched the Jimmy Kimmel show. I suspect I would not like it very much, so I'm not. But, it's clear that some of this censorship backfires, although it's willing to see where it goes.
That's all very disturbing information. So what does the order itself say?
Yeah, so the order itself says that Antifa, which again is an ideology, it stands for anti-fascist. It is not a coherent organization. There are perhaps groups that call themselves Antifa groups in the way that there are groups that call themselves socialist or conservative or anarchist groups. Is a militarist. I think they meant militant, but they said militarist anarchist enterprise that explicitly calls for the overthrow of the United States government, law enforcement authorities, and our system of law. It uses illegal means to organize and execute a campaign of violence and terrorism nationwide to accomplish these goals. It accuses Antifa of a number of illegal actions, including rioting, standoffs with law enforcement, attacks on ICE, and doxing. I don't know what doxing means in this context per se, but publishing public information about public officials is not doxing, or is doxing. It can be considered doxing, but it's not illegal. And if it was illegal, then the various campaigns to get school teachers and university professors and McDonald's drive-through workers fired for saying things people don't like about Charlie Kirk on social media, that would be illegal if we're saying doxing is illegal. And of course, I think those actions are odious and misguided, but they are protected by the First Amendment. And then it makes the claim that the suppression of lawful political speech that Antifa engages in is coercion and thus domestic terrorism. And the reason why they use coercion is that the statutory definition of domestic terrorism at the federal level is to intimidate or coerce a civilian population or influence government policy. There is no crime of domestic terrorism at the federal level, but there is a federal definition, and it mentions coercion. Then it mentions that he's going to designate them a domestic terrorist organization, and that he's going to have law enforcement investigate, disrupt, dismantle any and all illegal operations, especially those involving terrorist actions conducted by Antifa, any person claiming to act on behalf of Antifa, or for which an Antifa or any person claiming to act on behalf of Antifa provided material support. So pretty stunning order.
It absolutely is. So could you tell me, Chip, what are the various executive branch terrorism designations? Is this one of them?
No, it's not. So the executive branch has two means it uses to designate people as terrorists. The first is the International Emergency Powers Act. There is no language about terrorism to my knowledge in that act, but beginning with Clinton and sort of entrenched further by George W. Bush, the executive branch designates specially designated global terrorist. This can apply to a U.S. citizen or group like the Holy Land Foundation, but it requires some sort of international nexus. It is not for international groups. The Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996 amended the Immigration and Nationality Act to allow the Secretary of State to designate international groups, foreign groups, as foreign terrorist organizations, and it is a crime to provide material support to a foreign terrorist organization. It is also a crime to aid a federally designated, to materially support a federally designated act of terrorism, but that does not have any requirement that a group be designated as either a domestic or foreign terrorist organization, just that it be one of, I think, 97 statutes that include things like hijacking, but also computer intrusion. So there is no federal domestic designation here.
So if there's no domestic terrorism organization designation, does this order have any impact?
Yeah, I think it does. I don't think we should write this off just as bluster. I mean, it's possible that it is. But, the opening line of the order is that Antifa is a militarist anarchist enterprise. The FBI engages in what's called terrorist enterprise investigations. These are investigations that can involve violations of the federal definition of domestic terrorism, or hold on, I have the definition in front of me. Hold on, I pulled this up so I could read it. Furthering political or social goals wholly in part through activities that involve force or violence and a federal crime. There's also language in this sort of type of investigation about sort of the international terrorism and racketeering. That wouldn't, international terrorism would not apply here, racketeering would. And additionally, the FBI breaks down these investigations at the domestic level by persistent violent extremist movements. This includes for a designation called anarchist violent extremist. So there is a designation called anarchist extremist terrorist enterprise investigation. So if Antifa is an anarchist enterprise, presumably this is greenlighting the FBI to open that type of investigation. We also know the FBI has already investigated Antifa. In November 2017, FBI Director Christopher Wray said that while Antifa was an ideology, there were a number of anarchist extremist investigations into individuals who were inspired by an Antifa ideology. And Wray repeatedly made that remark, even though he came under fire for not saying that Antifa was a domestic terrorism organization, because the FBI does not have that designation, but they do have the terrorist enterprise investigation, which applies to a domestic organization, including an anarchist organization that they consider to be terrorist. The FBI operates currently under a preventative framework. For example, to carry out its central, this is the FBI guidelines, to carry out its central mission of preventing the commission of terrorist acts. The FBI must proactively draw on available sources to identify terrorist threats and activities. It cannot wait for leads to come in. So in order to carry this out, the guidelines create something called an assessment, which is designed to detect, obtain, or information about or prevent federal crimes or threats to national security. And it does not require a factual predicate that the party be involved in a violation of federal law or national security, threat to national security. It's just so they can sort of open these preventative investigations up to see if you might be a threat. And if they're looking for Antifa, if they're looking for anarchist threats, they're going to start with the speech when opening the investigation. And they can open the investigation in part based on speech. They can't open it entirely based on speech, but they can do it in part based on speech. And what we've seen again and again is the FBI looks and says, okay, we have to get anarchist extremists. Those are people who commit violence because they hate capitalism, racial hierarchy, social hierarchy, political hierarchy. Let's go find people who hate capitalism and globalization, and then open investigations on them.
Right. So Chip, you're probably one of the foremost, if not the foremost expert on the FBI's counterterrorism program in Washington today. Can you just walk us through, for people at home, what the FBI's current powers are?
Yeah, so the FBI has the power. So since 9/11, the FBI has been shifted away from a law enforcement agency that prosecutes terrorism after it happens to an intelligence agency that prevents terrorism before it happens and disrupts it. Trump's executive order uses the word disrupt. Disrupt is what the FBI used to justify the counterintelligence program or COINTEL program. It's also been the main term along with prevention since 9/11. The FBI is preventing and disrupting terrorism. The FBI's terrorism strategy, which was created during the Obama years, and I believe is still in place, was called a disruption strategy. So the FBI prevents and disrupts terrorism before it happens. In order to do so, agents are told to be proactive and find terrorists before they act, before information comes to them. They're supposed to be out searching the internet and elsewhere. And the FBI can, like I said before, open up these assessments. There's three types of FBI investigations. There's the enterprise investigation, which covers domestic, international terrorism plus racketeering. But it requires a criminal predicate or a threat to national security. There are full investigations, which require a factual reason to believe there's a violation of federal law, threat to national security, or a foreign intelligence collection purpose. And then there's assessments, which have no requirement for a factual predicate. And we saw an incident in Texas about a decade ago where the FBI investigated under the assessment level threshold an anti-pipeline group for, I think, 16 months to determine if they were extremist. All of the FBI's domestic terrorism definitions are of so-called persistent extremist movements. They all incorporate political speech into the definition. So Black extremists are motivated by perceptions about racism. That's the FBI's phrase. It's more than perceptions, obviously. Or a desire for a separate Black homeland. Puerto Rican extremists are motivated by a desire for Puerto Rican independence. Anarchist extremists are opposed to capitalism. I believe the FBI means globalization. They often say globalism, social, racial, political hierarchy, militia extremists, white supremacist extremists. We can go down the list. And, if you're looking to prevent anarchist extremist, you go and look for anarchist. And if you're told an anarchist is someone who opposes capitalism, globalization, hierarchy, you're looking for those points of views. So the FBI can, without any evidence that you are engaged in a crime, open an assessment or a threat to national security, which is an even broader concept, can open an assessment into you. And, certain things like wiretaps or electronic surveillance are regulated by statute, but most of what the FBI does is self-regulated by the Attorney General. They can task an informant or an infiltrator to sort of infiltrate your group. They can go through your trash, because the Supreme Court has very helpfully said that searching someone's trash is not a search. I think most people would disagree with that, but Supreme Court are such wise people. They know better than the rest of us, don't they? So they can engage in these incredibly intrusive techniques and investigations. They can also engage in what's called intelligence gathering and analysis, which gets into even more nebulous and broader powers. The FBI also has authorities to advise the president about potential civil unrest, to determine if he has to call in the military or take other actions. So the ways in which the FBI can spy on political speech are very, very broad. And one might even say they're hardwired in to the guidelines.
Yeah. So Chip, you mentioned the preventative framework. What's the origin of that?
Yeah, so after 9/11, John Ashcroft and Robert Mueller announced the FBI was no longer going to focus on law enforcement to prosecute terrorism after it happens, but use intelligence to prevent it before it occurs. And the FBI's current self-description is an intelligence-driven national security agency with intelligence and law enforcement components. You can tell they're very smart because they use intelligence twice in their description of themselves. But the preventative framework has a far deeper origins. People watching might be aware that in the 70s, the actions of the FBI under Hoover, Nixon's plumber unit, the CIA, all came under fire with revelations about domestic surveillance, foreign coups, things like that. And there was a Senate investigation called the Church Committee investigation, which exposed these actions and recommended limitations be placed on these agencies. Some are placed, but not as many as the Church Committee recommends. But there's a number of dissenting opinions in the Church Committee's report on FBI surveillance, one of which comes from the great supporter of human freedom, Barry Goldwater, who was upset that they were limiting executive power and that domestic terrorism was burgeoning in the country, and that therefore the FBI should not have its powers curtailed. And for most of this period, the FBI operated according to an executive order, a presidential directive from Roosevelt that allegedly allowed them to investigate subversive activities. This is quite controversial. I won't get into the history of interpreting that directive. Let's just say not everyone agrees they had that power. And then the FBI in the early 70s, right before the Church Committee, cites 6 criminal statutes and claims its intelligence program is designed to prevent violations of them. But Goldwater starts talking about terrorism. A few years after the Church Committee, the Heritage Foundation comes out with a report that says the U.S. will be besieged by terrorism the way Western Europe and Rhodesia, a now defunct apartheid state, were, because of the limitation of the FBI to investigate the Socialist Workers' Party, police departments no longer keeping list of communists, the disbanding of HUAC and the Subversive Activities Control board. So really a concerted effort to rebrand counter-subversion McCarthyite organs as now essential to counterterrorism. And the justification for the types of political surveillance the FBI had previously engaged in, the claim they need to bring it back, is to prevent terrorism. In the early 80s, there's a Senate subcommittee on terrorism, which is largely forgotten now, but was a huge deal at the time, with many people saying it was the return of HUAC. And during one of these, they have, I think, 5 separate hearings on FBI guidelines, trying to remove the restriction that the FBI can only investigate you under the domestic guidelines, not the foreign guidelines, the domestic guidelines, if they have reason to believe you committed a crime. And one of the co-authors of the Heritage Foundation report is one of the staffers on this committee. There's a big relationship between the Reagan White House, the Heritage Foundation, the Senate committees, and the FBI that I won't go too far into. But one of the senators during one of these hearings, Senator East, on FBI guidelines being too restrictive on the FBI, said, "Frequently, we are dealing here, it occurs to me, not so much with criminal activity per se, but gathering intelligence about potentially terrorist and subversive groups. Now, in short, I want prevention, I want surveillance." And the theory this subcommittee was putting forward, the theory the Heritage Foundation was putting forward, was that terrorism comes out of political movements. Therefore, we need preemptive and preventative surveillance of political movements so we know who the future terrorists are and we can stop them before they start. After 9/11, John Ashcroft, he drops the language about subversion, but they adopt this language wholesale, and it becomes the official policy of the FBI. But I should note, all throughout the 80s and 90s, the FBI is moving in this direction. I've obtained documents in litigation from August 2001, where the FBI says anarchists are, this is weeks before 9/11, where the FBI say anarchists are the big threat because A, they've already killed President McKinley. And I know many people were very upset by the assassination of President McKinley in August of 2001, top of their minds in U.S. threats. And the World Trade Organization protest in Seattle was a watershed protest. And watershed protest always leads to domestic terrorism.
Wow. Okay. Thank you. So what's President Trump's relationship to the FBI?
So Trump's relationship to the FBI is quite complicated. He's obviously very angry at the FBI for the Russiagate investigation, Operation Crossfire Hurricane, which investigated 4 or 5 of his campaign associates. I will note the 2016 election is very interesting in that it's the only presidential election I know of where either both major party candidates or their campaign associates are under FBI counterintelligence investigation. For the first part of the campaign, Hillary Clinton is under a counterintelligence investigation because of the issues with her email server. I will not make people relive that saga. And then after they close that out, they open Operation Crossfire Hurricane, a counterintelligence investigation to see if some of Trump's campaign associates are colluding with Russia. And then that becomes the Mueller investigation after Trump fires James Comey, and there are allegations he's engaged in obstruction of justice, and then Trump becomes, for the first time, an official target. During Operation Crossfire Hurricane, the FBI does engage in very serious abuses of power, mostly around obtaining a FISA warrant for Carter Page, a Trump campaign associate who I think was unpaid, using misleading and false information. And whatever one thinks of Mr. Trump, we're nonpartisan, but we've been probably the most vociferous critics of his national security policy, lying to the FISA court, lying to supervisors in order to get a warrant for Carter Page is, very unethical and very much a danger to our democracy. Mr. Page was a CIA asset, and he was meeting with Russian officials, and the FBI says, oh, look, he's meeting with Russian officials, and leaves out the part about he's working for the CIA and doing so and reporting back to them. So this looks so suspicious. In addition to the Russiagate investigation, where I think there are valid grievances, Trump tried to overturn the results of the 2020 election, and his supporters stormed the Capitol, engaged in a number of crimes with the intent to have the loser of an election declared the winner, That's a very ugly, anti-democratic thing to do. Whatever one thinks of that, whether it was a riot or terrorism or an insurrection, the FBI domestic terrorism program treats all rioting or potential rioting and civil unrest as terrorism. So the domestic terrorism unit has spent an enormous amount of time investigating January 6th, which has very much angered Mr. Trump. The flip side of this is that Trump is sort of representative of the right-wing id that has for years propelled FBI policy. He demonizes Muslims. He wanted in his first campaign in 2016 preemptive surveillance in mosques. He wanted things worse than torture. He wanted to kill people's families if they were engaged in terrorism. The sort of right-wing reactionary security hawk policies that you would think would endear him to the FBI. And during his first term, he did a lot of this Antifa hysteria as well, and it sort of crescendoed during the George Floyd protest. During the George Floyd protest, he had a very talented bureaucrat by his side named Bill Barr, who is now on the outs with Mr. Trump because he wouldn't help Trump overturn an election, but he did help Trump go after the George Floyd protesters. And he did this through using the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force, through creating a working group on anti-authority extremists that we were told focused on Antifa and the Boogaloo Boys. The memo of this creating this working group makes claims that are unsubstantiated about foreign influence on Antifa, and this is in response to the George Floyd protest. And we know since then the FBI was allowed to query NSA foreign intelligence data collected under Section 702 of FISA, which is supposed to target foreigners, not Americans. But if they incidentally collected Americans' communications, they can keep it, and they claim they can search without a warrant. They queried that data for both information about Black Lives Matter protesters arrested during George Floyd, as well as the January 6th rioters, insurrectionists, coup plotters, whatever you want to call them. So you see sort of no one's ever drawn a connection between Barr's memo and that, but it does seem like he was setting the stage for that. And when he would talk about the role of the Joint Terrorism Task Force in smashing the George Floyd protesters, he was very knowledgeable about how it worked and why it was a good model. You know, Trump is very interested in the spectacle of violence. He wants the FBI out on the street, beating up people for loitering or whatever. Outside my house the other weeks, there were 5 FBI agents checking someone's car for open containers, a big use of federal law enforcement, looking for open containers. There were none, but you would not be surprised to know the person who they pulled over under this pretense and whose license they ran through a database was Latino, which I think you can say that was clearly probably racial profiling. So Trump sort of likes the FBI doing spectacle of violence, beating up people. He likes the National Guard. There's clearly a preference for ICE and the DHS sort of security forces, as opposed to the more sophisticated intelligence gathering the FBI engages in. And right now, he's not really surrounded by talented bureaucrats like a Barr or a Hoover. He's surrounded by Stephen Miller and a bunch of podcasters, which, you know, the FBI is a great tool for a skilled authoritarian. The big question right now, we know Trump's an authoritarian, is he skilled? But in spite of all of the bluster about Trump being at odds with the FBI, with Kash Patel being at odds with the counterterrorism bureaucracy over J6, during Trump 1, they used it to go after George Floyd protesters. This was orchestrated by Barr. And after Trump started going on and on and on about Antifa, we know that people were arrested or stopped and asked about their relationship with Antifa, which we can expect to happen again.
Yeah, so this is obviously a very troubling moment for free speech. What is the state of free speech in the U.S. today?
Unfortunately, the state of free speech today was even before this sort of second Trump Antifa hysterical McCarthyite reaction was really quite poor. Since the genocide in Gaza, we have witnessed the worst situation for freedom of speech since the War on Terror. Obviously, freedom of speech was not in good state before then. for a number of reasons, but the Gaza stuff really got a lot of the repression escalated. Since Trump has come into office, he has taken what is the worst free speech crisis since the War on Terror and turned it into the worst free speech crisis since the McCarthy era, if not the Palmer raids. We see intelligence gathering within the Department of Homeland Security against non-citizens about their speech in order to stage politically motivated deportations. We know he's very close to the Heritage Foundation, who wants to bring RICO charges, what he wants to do against Antifa people, against the quote-unquote Hamas support network, by which they mean people who oppose Israel's genocide. And we have seen this bipartisan crackdown on Palestine-related speech. And now Trump is stepping in to make it even worse and expand it. But Trump would not have the tools to do this if we weren't already in this free speech. Well, he would somewhat, but not to the extent if we weren't already in the free speech crisis. And unfortunately, a lot of people embrace this Palestine exception to the First Amendment. And people who looked the other way when the crackdown was about Palestinian speech have paved the way for Trump to come in and expand this to the left writ large. Obviously, many people were speaking out against the crackdown that was taking place. But it is important to note, this isn't happening in a vacuum. The FBI has the broadest powers it's had since Watergate, in part because of a bipartisan expansion of them. So we've been in a very parallel situation for some time, and it's about to get a lot worse.
Okay, well, thank you, Chip. Chip Gibbons is our policy director at Defending Rights and Dissent, where he defends our right to know and freedom to act. He's also spent over a decade reporting on U.S. national security policy and is the author of the forthcoming book, The Imperial Bureau, the FBI, Political Surveillance, and the Rise of the U.S. National Security State. If you enjoyed this hard-hitting analysis that you won't find anywhere else, please consider visiting rightsanddissent.org and make a donation to support our work. And before you go, please like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you all so much for joining us. Have a great rest of the day.